Ashes of Creation, one of the highest profile Kickstarter projects and also one of the highest profile Kickstarter failures. I talked all about this Kickstarter MMO that's been in development for like almost 9 years back in February 2nd, 2026 in this video titled Ashes of Creation MMO Collapses After Sudden Studio Implosion. Kickstarter backers demand answers. There's been some new developments since that I want to talk about, but for those who want a brief rundown, basically, this is an MMO project that launched back in May 1st, 2017 on Kickstarter. It was immensely successful, garnering over $3.2 million from almost 20,000 backers supporting this project, and it was all being spearheaded by this individual, creative director Stephen Sheriff, who had grand visions of an MMO that'd be incredibly reactive to players' actions, and the world would be shaped based on how players collectively behaved in the world. It was an incredibly ambitious project whose ideas drew a lot of attention, but then people started looking into some of the people involved, including Stephen Sheriff, and that's when things started to become a little suspect. It turned out Stephen Sheriff had a background in multi-level marketing, which is a controversial form of business that is like pyramid scheme-esque. Then there's the fact that Stephen Sheriff had no real experience developing games, and the team he did assemble, while they had some experience, it wasn't the level of experience you'd expect to build an MMO of this ambition. There's the controversial referral program that they tried to leverage, where essentially creators who promoted this Kickstarter would get money for a game that doesn't really even exist yet, which reminded people of multi-level marketing enough that it drew some suspicion. And there were also suspicions surrounding the promise that if no game releases from this Kickstarter campaign, then Stephen Sheriff himself would refund all Kickstarter backers. Now, over the course of years, people would see progress on Ashes of Creation, however slow it was. 4 years after the Kickstarter campaign, they launched a first playable alpha that ultimately was met with mixed reception because a lot of systems were still underbaked, and it was very much a game that had a long way to go. But as the years would go by, we would continue to get updates from the developers, and things seemed to be going well enough to the point where we eventually did see a December 11th, 2025 launch. The game would launch in early access at a cost of $50, but you don't see that price point here anymore because the game has since been delisted due to the fact that basically the development team behind this MMO, Intrepid Studios, has practically imploded and left the game in an untenable state from a development standpoint, which is why you'll find that recent reviews are overwhelmingly negative because, it's been an almost 9-year-long journey only for the MMO to shut down 2 months after launch, leaving people feeling like they were scammed. It was throughout January 31st to February 1st, 2026 when we first started hearing rumblings about Intrepid Studios' implosion, with Margaret Crone here, who was the director of marketing communications at Intrepid Studios, and in many ways being the face of this project, coming out and saying, well, this chapter has come to a close. My time at Intrepid Studios has officially ended. Keeping details rather vague, but straight up saying that as for how this all ended, I don't really have the words. It wasn't what I expected. With indications that a lot of people were laid off during this whole process, and going to Intrepid Studios LinkedIn, you can see that a lot of people who once worked at the studio now have hashtag open to work on their profile photo, suggesting that there were significant layoffs. And Stephen Sheriff eventually responded with this statement where he too was vague and talked about some kind of hostile takeover on the part of the board of directors, and so in protest, he resigned, and following his resignation, allegedly, much of the senior leadership team resigned, and he blames that board of directors for issuing the Warren Act notices that signal not only a mass layoff, but full-on the shutdown of the studio from the looks of things. In terms of why he was keeping details vague, he just said that because of ongoing legal and governance matters, he cannot responsibly speak in further details at this time, so there's still a lot of mystery surrounding this whole situation. But Stephen Sheriff, being the leader of this project, a lot of this is his responsibility, and so a lot of blame is being shifted to him, especially with questions surrounding what board of directors, when you once upon a time said that we aren't governed by greedy corporate overlords, I'm funding the project, so no investors or a board to answer to, no publishers to appease, and all of a sudden we're learning that there was a board of directors and that they caused all of this and that they did some kind of hostile takeover. Things just don't add up compared to what Stephen Sheriff said previously. And with his past with multi-level marketing, people are is this a scam? Like, was this intentional on the part of Steven? Just a lot of suspicion being thrown around, but we don't really know the full story quite yet. Except that Ashes of Creation took a lot of money from a lot of people, led them on for 9 years, only for this MMO to launch and crash and burn 2 months after its release, and for it to also launch in a very feature incomplete, just very unfinished, and for 9 years of development, a lot of people felt like this MMO should have been at a further state. And then there's accusations surrounding its early access launch, with a lot of people suspecting that it was done so that they can technically fulfill the promise of, if the game doesn't launch, then we'll return the money. And since the game technically did launch in some state, in this case, early access state, they don't have to fulfill that promise because they technically launched the game, even if in a bare bones and incomplete state that culminated in it kind of collapsing 2 months after launch. People are also wondering how they're going to fulfill all of these Kickstarter obligations, like hosting people who paid over $10,000 with invitations to, like launch parties and dinners and stuff like that. That's just no longer going to happen. So just a completely disastrous, catastrophic, calamitous end to an MMO that had a lot of potential based on its concepts, but not based on its execution. And now we have a new update from none other than Margaret Crone herself, who spoke at greater length about her experience with what happened on this front. And yeah, this paints some additional light into some of the mystery surrounding what the hell just happened, how this implosion could happen so suddenly, seemingly without warning. Here is how Margaret Crone recounts her side of the story. Quote, "I waited until today to share this because I wanted to be sure I was communicating from a place of clarity. Intrepid Studios has shut down in a way that I did not expect. What I can share is what I experienced. On January 28th, towards the end of the workday, I was informed that we would be laying off 100 developers. I was devastated. These are hardworking people who are going to lose their jobs. Still, I believed it was something we could face together and find a path forward." So yeah, the initial plan was a round of mass layoffs that would result in roughly 100 employees getting laid off, a significant portion of the, around 250 employees that were working at Intrepid Studios, but it would still keep the studio alive to continue working on this project. But those plans quickly shifted. On January 29th, I shared this information of the mass layoffs that were incoming confidentially with my game services team. I told them that changes were coming, that I did not yet know who would be affected, and that I wished I had more certainty to offer. I could not live with myself if I did not give them advance notice. These are people who deserve to be treated like human beings. By the end of the day, I received confirmation of which people on my team would be impacted. Then on January 30th, I spoke individually with each of my team members to let them know whether they were affected so they could begin planning and preparing. Those who were staying began working on ways to move forward. Even those who knew they would be leaving offered their support, showing the grace, professionalism, and strength that defined our game services team. Then, a day later, on January 31st, we were all informed via a confusing email that we would be laid off along with a warn notice. It is still shocking. The entire studio gathered to try to understand what had happened and what it meant for our future. In the end, none of us are receiving our final paychecks, the 60 days notice and pay outlined under the WARN Act, PTO payouts or pay time off payouts, or other compensation owed. So beyond the chaotic nature of how all of this played out, where over the course of a few days, we went to mass layoffs that would still keep the studio and the team alive, to suddenly everyone getting laid off out of the blue with no explanation whatsoever, to the fact that the folks who worked at this development studio would not receive their final payment checks alongside other elements that they're owed. It paves the road to one of the most sudden, confusing, mysterious, and egregious ways in which a studio has shut down and laid off employees. The statement continues, "What matters most to me now are the people, both the players and the developers. To the players, the entire development team was working extremely hard, pulling long hours and wishes with all our hearts that we could give you Ashes of Creation. There are no words that fully express how sorry we are that this journey ended this way. You should pursue a refund. You deserve it." So Margaret Crone has been as transparent as she can be throughout all of this, and she's been incredibly gracious and constantly addressing the players. And there's a general understanding amongst the community that the developers, the folks who were working for the captain, clearly try their best to keep the ship afloat, clearly gave this project their all, and that all of this is definitely a result of some kind of leadership mismanagement that is still a mystery right now. But I find it interesting that she makes no mention of Steven Sheriff, doesn't highlight his contributions, doesn't really talk about him at all, doesn't try to absolve him of all of the criticisms and all of the accusations that he's currently facing. And to me, either that says that Margaret is just keeping quiet about that side of things because of legal situations and legal matters. Another possibility is that she's completely out of the loop and just cannot comment on Stephen Sheriff because she herself does not know exactly what went down and how culpable Stephen is or isn't. Or, she kind of knows more than she's letting on and doesn't want to speak about Stephen because maybe he has a lot of the blame to carry for how all of this played out. And I don't see how that wouldn't be the case, given that Stephen is the creative director of this project. He was the one spearheading this whole endeavor. She continues, to my colleagues, this team is truly a family. The culture we built together is something I have never experienced anywhere else. In the midst of heartbreak and uncertainty, we have come together to review resumes, help with portfolios, share job leads, and support one another emotionally. That says everything about who we are as people. And then she presents a link to a form for hiring managers and recruiters to fill out to try to pave the road to these employees being able to land on their feet with future prospects. And yeah, lending further credence to Intrepid Studios laying off all of the employees and imploding as a studio and not just going through a round of mass layoffs that will retain some team members to keep working on the game is this WARN Act letter right here that was filed by Intrepid Studios in the state of California, in which they cite that on January 31st, 2026, Intrepid Studios issued a layoff notice to all of its employees. The company has no alternative other than to undertake an entire and permanent plant closing within the meaning of the WARN Act by close of business on February 2nd, 2026. So they laid off all employees, and by February 2nd, 2026, it seemed as though they're basically closing shop for Intrepid Studios as a whole. The statement continues, bumping rights will not exist. The number of affected employees is approximately 210, which is about the size that Intrepid Studios was at the time of all of this happening. Please see attached WARN Act's notice as delivered to employees for more information. All of this coming from Rick Kular, who is the HR consultant appointed by Intrepid Studios. And beyond this WARN Act submission getting leaked, there's also a list of all of the different roles that were laid off. And yeah, it's pretty much everyone. And then beyond that, Stephen recently issued another statement as folks demand a formal statement from Stephen explaining exactly what happened here, with many believing that that's the least Stephen can do for a community that's been supporting Stephen and his endeavors and Intrepid Studios as a team for 9 years and giving them all of the benefits of the doubt, only for all of this to culminate in the way that it did just 2 months after the game's launch, where all the hopes and dreams surrounding this game just completely collapsed like a house of cards. Stephen had the following to say in response to somebody saying, we need a formal statement before the reputation is ruined even further. He said, it is certainly heartbreaking to see the impact to the people I care about, both my developers and community. But given what has transpired and the lack of facts available to the public, the reputational impact is something that cannot be avoided until the record is set straight with the proper public filings. Unfortunately, that takes a little bit of time. So Stephen is insinuating that there is more to the story than meets the eye, and while he's not directly saying this wasn't my fault, I think he is suggesting that one day I'll be able to speak to exactly what happened behind the scenes from my perspective. I'll be able to set the record straight, and hopefully then the public will be able to agree with why things played out the way they did and how, me, Stephen, didn't want any of this to happen, how this wasn't my fault or whatever. I don't know. It seems like that's the implication of this, where he's saying that one day when I'm able to speak to the full truth about matters and how all this played out behind the scenes, then I'll be absolved of some of the accusations that I'm receiving. It doesn't change the fact that Stephen led this team, led this project, and ultimately the responsibility does fall on him. But whether all the accusations being levied against him, where, this is all some kind of intentional scam, there's Stephen hearkening back to multi-level marketing days, whether all of that is true with this project, or whether he genuinely tried with Ashes of Creation and then circumstances outside of his control fucked him over, that's where the mystery is still abound. That's where I cannot definitively say one way or another until more information comes to light. But currently, people have nobody else to blame but Stephen Sheriff, who said things in the past that, again, are not in alignment with current developments about, a board of directors taking over. It makes no sense, given Stephen has said before that there is no board of directors. There's no one for them to answer to. And now he's saying that he had people to answer to. And then beyond that, spearheading this project for 9 years, the amount of progress that was made was not sufficient enough. And for this MMO to crumble 2 months after launch, and just seeing how the tactic of releasing Ashes of Creation in early access in a very incomplete shape and form, just so that they wouldn't have to refund Kickstarter backers who kind of deserve to be refunded, given that they never ultimately got the full promise of this game. All of that is being seen as fucked up, and it's not painting Steven Sheriff in a good light and in a way that makes him look like innocent in all of this. But again, I'm sure we'll get more details down the line that I'll report on once we get them. In the meantime, though, people have warned Steam about all of this, which is why Steam took the step to take down the ability to buy this game. People are flooding the reviews with negative reviews, with thumbs downs. That has led to mostly negative reviews overall and overwhelmingly negative reviews recently, with plenty of folks warning that this game has shut down. And you've got the Ashes of Creation community trying to work together to find the best way to get refunds for this game. Some people have shown their successful attempts at refunding Ashes of Creation. There's an individual who played 10 hours of this game and managed to issue the following statement when they submitted their ticket for refund and managed to actually get their refund. But others were not so successful, with this individual reporting that their refund request was denied. But for this individual, the circumstances are a little different because they played around 260 hours of Ashes of Creation. And at that point, the grace period for a refund for a game that technically did release, that you paid for, kind of expires, whereas people who've played 10, 15 hours, for example, here are having no trouble getting a refund. So a large aspect of whether you get a refund or not for this game will depend on just how much of it you've actually played. And that's the risk you take when you shell out money at the Kickstarter phases of a grand MMO game like Ashes of Creation, or when you engage with its early access and shell out money for it. There is a chance that it just won't pan out. And within reason, you can get refunds, but otherwise, if you've played hundreds of hours of the game, the likelihood of you getting a refund are less likely, just by the policy of how this stuff works. But it's worth noting that there are folks who had to apply for a refund multiple times before being accepted, so maybe with persistence, it can still work no matter what your playtime is. But just know what your likelihood is based on whether you played a dozen hours or a dozen 100 hours. But yeah, people are highlighting ways in which you can circumvent when, you get auto shut down for refund requests when you try to submit another refund ticket for the same game. There are ways in which you can find other ways to send the same message through different tactics that will lead you to contacting customer support about this issue. So yeah, the community is coming together to try to remove themselves from this failed venture and project that dragged along for 9 whole years, only to never really show the potential of what was promised, and only for it to crumble before that any semblance of that promise would really be realized in a way that shows that this project was ever really possible. So yeah, the Ashes of Creation situation has gone from bad to worse with the new information that we got about just how chaotically, how sporadically, and how suddenly all of this happened behind the scenes, and the way the developers aren't even getting paid because the company ran out of money, so they literally don't have the ability to issue final paychecks. It feels like developers were kept in the dark about a lot of behind the scenes goings-ons and troubles that leadership did not disclose. And then when shit finally hit the fan, they had no choice but to surprise the employees and developers who were toiling away at this game and doing the best they could under the circumstances, with notices of essentially not only being laid off, but years of work that they poured into this being for naught, being completely wasted, and also just being screwed on the payment standpoint that allows them to have a livelihood. There's also no mention of any severance, which obviously isn't possible given that Intrepid Studios seemingly has completely run out of money. So it's just fucked across the board for the developers and employees, for the players in the community, and for the game and the project, which had high ambitions that it would seem as though it never really ultimately had a chance on executing on based on the leadership mismanagement that happened here. No doubt that both developers and community members alike will seek answers, will demand answers, because what transpired here, the way it transpired for Ashes of Creation, is just not right. And no doubt that investigations will be conducted. Somebody will get to the bottom of this, and we will find out exactly who the responsible parties surrounding this are. And no doubt that heads will roll once those people are called out. But Until then, this is kind of the latest you need to know about Ashes of Creation for those keeping up with this story. In the meantime, though, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on this whole Ashes of Creation situation in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.